Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for being with us this evening. I know most of you, but I'm going to introduce myself anyway. I'm June Kohler. I'm an assistant curator for the Arts of the Americas in Europe here at the JSMA. I am delighted to be able to introduce Professor Sherwin Simmons of the Department of the History of Art and Architecture to you all. I had the pleasure of taking several courses from Sherwin and working with him as my thesis advisor during my time in the Department of Art History. And I can tell you that you're in for a treat this evening. After completing his BA in art history at Yale University and both his MA and PhD at Johns Hopkins, Sherwin came to the University of Oregon, where he has been a dedicated and wonderfully engaged professor since 1973. In addition to teaching some of the department's most popular courses, he has advised more than 50 master's theses and served as a reader on countless other committees. Apart from being a much beloved professor, Sherwin has established himself as one of the foremost authorities on the European avant-garde, publishing more than 30 articles in such prestigious journals as the Art Bulletin and the Oxford Art Journal. One of his most recent essays will be included in the exhibition catalog for German Expressionism and France, to open at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, with appearances at the Kunsthaus in Zurich and the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal in 2014. We at the JSMA are delighted that Sherwin was able to take time out of his busy schedule to guest curate the show on view upstairs in the Focus Gallery on Max Pechstein and German Expressionist art. The fact that he used it as a teaching opportunity by including the students who will speak this evening is further evidence of his dedication to teaching. On behalf of everyone at the JSMA, I'd like to offer our gratitude to Sherwin for his years of service at the university and the museum. Please join me in welcoming Sherwin.
Thanks, June. I appreciate that, and I can't tell you how delighted I am that you've stayed on in Eugene for a while. I hope you stay on longer, because I enjoyed working with you on your master's thesis very, very much, and subsequently as well. So as you see, this is an installation shot of the exhibition upstairs, and ballet dancers, the painting literally at the center of the exhibition, was painted by Max Pechstein in 1912. He was living in Berlin at that time, and this was the year that he was expelled from the artist group Bridge on May 15th, 1912, for exhibiting with the Berlin Secession. Later that year, however, he was given his first one-person show in November at the Goltz Gallery in Munich, and during that year, he really became the most publicized of the original members of Die Brücke, or the Bridge. Our School of Architecture and Allied Arts purchased this painting in 1953 from a traveling exhibition for $252. A good buy. It was transferred to the Museum of Art in 1967, where it's been written about by many students. So many that I don't even attempt to catch plagiarism. It's been written by so many students because for years it was the museum's only significant example of European modernism. It's worn out by eyes. It's been a valuable resource for that reason, but its dollar value has also grown, with similar works by Pechstein now bringing between $500,000 and $1 million. It was considered significant enough to be requested for the largest and most important exhibition of Pechstein's work, held at the Kunsthalle in Kiel, Germany, in 2010. However, when examined by a conservation lab, you can read all the details if you have really good eyes, it was discovered that its flaking paint was too insecure to allow it to travel. Since that time, however, generous donations have allowed it to be cleaned, restored, and reframed so that the painting on the canvas's other side may be seen. So you can get a sense of what the cleaning did, right? Thanks to the support of Jill Hartz and Ann Rose Kitagawa, I received an academic support grant to organize a small exhibition around this work. So, seeking works that would represent the various currents of German Expressionism for a class that I'm teaching this term, Professor Joyce Chang and I requested works from the Vivian and Gordon Gilkey Center for Graphic Arts at the Portland Art Museum and also the Oregon State University Memorial Union. The former were generously honored by Mary Chapin, the center's new director, and the exhibition has served a variety of art history classes during its run. Joyce and I are grateful to June Kohler, Charlie Swing, and other staff members for helping to organize and hang the exhibition. Although it will be taken down after Sunday, it will be seen by participants in an academic conference on German Expressionism to be held this Saturday in Gerlinger Lounge from 9 to 5. Professor Chang solicited financial support for this conference from various sources, including the museum's Academic Support Awards, and all of you and others are invited to attend what I think will be a really stimulating discussion of an important cultural movement of the early 20th century. So now let's turn to discussion of the works in the exhibition. So I'm going to provide some observations about the three paintings by Pechstein, to be followed by comments from art history graduate students about the exhibition's 10 prints. Following these discussions, we will sit up here at the tables and be happy to respond to questions. We'd also be happy, if it's possible, to people want to go upstairs and look at the works, that would be great as well. So first, some information about Pechstein's background. Born into a textile workers' family in Zwickau, a town about 60 miles southwest of Dresden, he studied art in that major city, which had become an important art center in the 18th century. He earned the equivalent of an MFA in decorative mural painting from the city's Academy of Fine Arts in 1907. But he had joined a radical young artist group called Die Brücke, or The Bridge, which held its first exhibition in a lighting manufacturer's showroom in 1906. Its members rejected the current style of Impressionism, turning to Van Gogh and the Neo-Impressionists for inspiration. However, Pechstein's stay in Paris during 1908 directed their attention to the work of Henri Matisse and the Fauves. And after his return to Germany, Pechstein and other group members began to employ the simplified contour lines and pure colors loosely applied to flattened zones of canvas found in Matisse's work. By 1909, the group had won some renown, as signaled by Pechstein's poster for the group's exhibition in the gallery, now of one of Dresden's major art dealers. In summer 1910, the connection between the young French and German artists was recognized at the Sonderbund exhibition in Dusseldorf. The catalog forward opposed this new art to Impressionism's passive reception of nature, is the way the critics described it. While the critic Max Raphael wrote the following: "It is understood that nature loses every objective value and that the fantasy of the artist creating in color wins an unconfined, unrestrained freedom. The picture is no longer a profusion of seemingly arbitrary points or spots of color, but is divided into 2 or 3 large color areas. The artistic power expresses itself in the rhythm in which the areas stand in relationship to each other and the bodies set upon them. Then in the coordination of colors, which must have a particular ring because one must see in large surfaces. So in subsequent articles after this exhibition of 1910, this art that we see on the screen, both the French and also the German, was described as expressionist. Now, dance, particularly as represented in the variety theater, became an important theme for Pechstein and other artists during 1909-10. It embodied the movement and sensuality of the modern world for them, but its representation in German art at this moment was very unusual because Germany, unlike France, had absolutely no tradition of the artistic depiction of dance and popular theater during the 19th century. Perhaps we can discuss this afterwards. Only at the beginning of the new century did such themes appear in German paintings and posters. In their paintings, Die Brücke members took their lead from Kees van Dongen, a Dutch member of the Fauves, whom they invited to join their group in 1909. They produced hundreds of sketches in the theaters on which they based their prints and drawings. Variety acts became the subject of other expressionist painters and poets in Berlin during this time, around 1910, 1911. And I would say that Ernst Kirchner was the artist who treated the theme most frequently and with the greatest expressive force. In some cases, the variety act or dancers can be identified, as in this painting by Pechstein, that shows the characters of Harlequin and Pierrot as they appeared in a short pantomime entitled Harlequin's Millions that was part of a program at the Kroll Opera in Berlin on May 5th, 1909. We know that Pechstein attended that performance. Sponsored by the Berlin Secession, this was the first performance of the Russian Royal Ballet, not the Ballet Russe, but the Russian Royal Ballet in Berlin, and created an immense sensation since it stood in contrast to the moribund tradition of the German ballet. The same troupe visited Dresden, where they gave a performance at a variety theater, the Central Theater, that was seen by Ernst Kirchner and resulted in a lithograph that depicted the part of the program that featured the prima ballerina. In most cases, however, as with our painting, the specific act is unknown. I read the 2 dancers as entering the stage, stepping forward of the colorfully painted coulisses with linked arms and acknowledging the theater's crowd. I questioned the title, although it was used when the work was shown in an exhibition in Leipzig in 1917, because the dresses and undergarments do not resemble ballet costumes, even those of the Ballet Russe. For years, I thought that the painting dated more likely to 1910 because of its brilliant and textured color, which results in an emphasis of the two-dimensional surface similar to what is found in Singer, which is a securely dated painting of 1910. Certainly you can see that the modeling of his bathers during 1912 had resulted in a much more three-dimensional treatment of his figures, as seen on the right. However, Aya Soika, a German friend and really the major Pechstein scholar, has found a letter of April 28, 1912, that contains a drawing that I think is closely related to our painting. And so, I mean, unlike Kirchner, didn't lie about his work. If he says 1912, I should understand it's 1912. This means that this is Pechstein's final painting of a scene of popular entertainment. No more in the rest of his career. But it's also the work that draws him most closely to the works of Ernst Kirchner, the most enthusiastic painter of this subject matter. But what about the other side of our painting? As you can see, saving canvas by painting both sides was common practice for Pechstein and other members of Die Brücke. In many cases, we can document that both sides were considered finished and that the canvas was reversed and restretched to show one or the other side in different exhibitions over the course of the teens and the 20s, and so forth. There is, however, no evidence that the back, the verso, of our painting was shown in an exhibition. Pechstein may have considered it unfinished, or perhaps the subject matter may have been too personal. Its subject matter is indeed enigmatic and very different from other interior scenes that might depict his wife modeling in the nude, or perhaps simply sleeping, unaware of being the subject of a painting, even though the artist and the cat are watching her. In our painting, there seems to be two beds, and a clothed woman seems to care for another woman who is either naked or in white bedclothes. Oh, what an embarrassment. It's nothing like the speaker's phone. I don't think I've ever seen that. Unbelievable. There are two known events in Pechstein's life during 1912 that may have triggered such a representation. This is just guessing, right? The first was the birth of his first child, Paul Frank Pechstein, on July 27, 1912, tragically followed by this child's death a few days later. The second was that Lottie, his wife, was hospitalized during Christmas 1912 for an extremely severe kidney infection. However, such conjectures are challenged, I think, by the fact that Lottie Pechstein had an extremely swarthy complexion. I don't know. Finally, let's turn to the still life painting that we borrowed. It was also painted by Pechstein in 1912 and was acquired by the Oregon State University Memorial Union in the early 1950s, around the time that we purchased our painting. It apparently hung in the hallway of the Union, unmolested by hundreds of thousands of students, until around 15 years ago when it was placed in storage. I had no idea of its existence until 2008 when Aya Soika asked me to photograph it for the Pechstein Catalogue Raisonné. It's an interesting work, closely related to several other still lifes, probably done after Pechstein visited an exhibition of Paul Cézanne's work held at the Cassirer Gallery in Berlin in April of 1912. He adopted the strongly raked tablecloth, the fruit bowls, the white vessels painted with floral motifs, and the ornately patterned colored drape directly from Cézanne. It's clear that Pechstein was trying to move away from the more two-dimensional effect of his previous still lifes, which had been indebted to Henri Matisse. Even Max Raphael, who was Pechstein's friend and an articulate supporter of this early, flat, decorative, expressionist style, had come to write, quote, "Today's grave is the decorative panneau, the poster, complete emptiness." So Raphael had seen Picasso and abandoned his previous set of values. So thus Pechstein's increased plasticity drew his praise, for he wrote that Pechstein's new work, quote, fulfilled Cézanne's two requirements, a personal sensibility and a personal logic, expressing a feeling for life that distanced it from the pure surface and pure color of formalism, and he said, gave Germans a new art. Pechstein soon sought to enrich Cézanne's example with new elements, such as the inclusion of nude figures and the addition of African objects to the still life materials. The African pipe bowl became the central object of blue anemones, another still life of 1912. Standing on a white saucer on the stove top, its rich blue form radiates a magical power throughout the gray surroundings, an effect amplified by the blue anemones that bloom from the head. Produced in bronze and terracotta by tribes in the grasslands of Cameroon, which was a German colony, such pipes were signs of social status, the largest reserved for kings and nobles. Since the bowl where the tobacco was burned is just behind the headdress, it's telling that I think that Pechstein placed the pipe head over the oven's firebox, and that the flowers rise from the stem hole, through which smoke was drawn from the bowl. If the stove pipe at the painting's right edge embodies pure utility, as it vents coal smoke over Berlin, the anemones communicate an aesthetic value that remains when the pipe head's utility is removed, a beauty that originally served a ritual function, just as the stove may have functioned as a social site in winter. In subsequent paintings, Pechstein was able to fuse Cézanne's lesson of color, form, and space with non-Western art in a more personal and aesthetically satisfying way. Now I'd like to introduce Megan Cekander, a first-year graduate student in art history who helped develop the wall text for the exhibition, and we'll discuss the prints by Pechstein and two other Brücke members, Otto Müller and Ernst Kirchner. Megan?
As Professor Simmons has discussed, Pechstein found artistic inspiration beyond the Western world in places like Africa, as well as Micronesia. Like other artists of Die Brücke, he had access to non-Western objects in Germany, such as those on view at Dresden's Ethnographic Museum. Yet a unique opportunity arose in 1914, which allowed him to experience an indigenous culture himself. Influenced by Gauguin's travels to French Polynesia, and under the sponsorship of the Gurlitt Gallery, Pechstein and his wife traveled to the islands of Palau, a German colony in Micronesia. During his time there, he made many drawings, watercolors, and woodcuts of the Palauan landscape, and also the people who inhabited it. The palm trees in the sketch pictured, as well as the painting Approaching Monsoon, to the bottom left, present a rather different scenery than what Pechstein would have seen in Berlin. Unfortunately, the outbreak of World War I disrupted his plans of a 2-year stay on the islands. Japanese forces invaded Palau, and Pechstein was transported to Nagasaki, where he was interned. Although he and his wife safely returned to Europe after a long, circuitous journey, the artist lost most of the work he had produced. In addition, Pechstein was conscripted to fight on the Western Front, yet his memories of Palau did not fade quickly. After a transfer to Berlin,
he began to produce a major series of paintings inspired by his experiences in the South Pacific for the Gurlitt Gallery, which sold well. By this time, Pechstein had become the most famous expressionist painter, so his trip had been well publicized. Much of the resulting work showed idyllic scenes from the South Seas, such as Palau Triptych. In the center panel, the artist illustrates daily life in the village, while the outer panels show other villagers on long wooden boats. Pechstein's portrayal seems to celebrate the ways of this community, which he has described as a handsome people living in total harmony, despite the recent social changes that colonialism had brought. During his stay, the artist befriended some of the local headmen where he lived. The portrait to the bottom right, which depicts Rubisak, a local leader and friend of Pechstein. The three-quarter profile of the figure prominently displays a hairpin tucked between his wavy locks, as well as a bracelet and a loincloth. Sure, I'm sorry. This detail is similar to the one in our print on display here. Exotic Head 4 is a woodcut from the same period as the painting just mentioned. In this work, the figure's hairpin has more ornamentation, such as the scalloped edge on the top, as well as two figures. Thick, dark lines delineate the figure's native adornments, which also includes large earplugs and a beaded necklace. It is these elements that suggest that the artist is depicting a Palauan man, an important distinction since Exotic Head 4 is part of a series that shows individuals from many different cultures. Comprised of 6 woodcuts, Pechstein's edition titled Exotic Heads offers an anthropological-like study of the subjects. Though Exotic Head 4 most likely represents an individual from Palau, other works in this series draw from pre-Columbian cultures. Many of the particulars of these prints correspond, in fact, to existing cultural artifacts. For example, the figure in the print to the top left wears an elaborate headdress, similar to the one worn by Pakal the Great of the Mayans. Unfortunately, the body of the statue has been lost, so it's hard to confirm other possible artistic correlations between the two. To the lower left, Pechstein shows a figure wearing a Toltec headdress and breastplate, which the image of the complete statue confirms. By looking at objects in ethnographic museums, as well as images in books, Pechstein could have used this research to create these works that replicate authentic details. Another of our prints is by Otto Müller, an artist from Silesia who studied in Dresden before Die Brücke had formed. In 1908, he moved to Berlin and met Brücke artists like Pechstein through the New Secession exhibition of 1910. He joined the group shortly after. At this point in his artistic career, Müller had already turned to the theme of the nude in nature, which he would paint for the rest of his life. His woodcut titled Girl Between Plants shows this prominent theme in his work. Resting on the ground, a young woman stares out towards the viewer from between groups of vegetable forms, which symmetrically frame her. Likewise, in its companion piece featuring an adolescent boy, Müller maintains the frontality of his figures. The dark background dominates both prints, though a broken line at the top of the woodcuts creates a minimal sense of landscape. The members of Die Brücke were attracted to Müller, as they had turned to the theme of the nude in nature during the summer of 1909. They traveled to the picturesque Moritzburg Lakes, which are located just north of Dresden, to work from live models among nature. In 1910, Müller joined the group's second trip to the lakes. There, the artist pursued the subject of the nude in oil paintings, prints, and particularly woodcuts. The other Brücke members encouraged Müller, who had made only lithographs before joining the group, to take up the technique of woodcutting. Girl with Plants is a product of this influence upon Müller. In contrast to the vibrant colors and loose brushwork of the paintings, which create a blurry effect in the works of Pechstein and Erich Heckel, Müller's hard angles that compose the forms, and his use of black ink upon white paper create a stylized representation of nature. The woodcut is also the medium of the final print that I will discuss by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. He had also traveled with Pechstein and Mueller to the Moritzburg Lakes in the summers of 1909 and 1910. In the works displayed, he presents the nude in the act of bathing at the lake's waters, rather than enjoying the landscape around it. In Elizabeth Embankment, Berlin, Kirchner maintains an abstracted style to portray an urban scape. A year before this woodcut was made, Die Brücke had moved to Berlin. Excited by the metropolis that was so fast-paced, huge, and anonymous compared to the 18th century of Dresden, the artists began to create artwork that reflected their experiences of the city, as seen in the print. Berlin at this time was the second largest city in the world, in addition to being Germany's capital. For such a large hub to work, Berlin required a vast network of transportation systems to function. Streets and railways moved people, while canalways transported heavy goods. The artists of Die Brücke often took up this theme of transportation in different media, making many drawings, prints, and paintings. Kirchner's print illustrates the Elizabeth Canal. Based on his sketches, he produced other works of the subject, such as oil paintings, as well as our print on display. Each of the works show the curve of the bridge, the angles of the street, and also the tall steeples of a church off in the distance. The place that Kirchner depicts was a particular site that had become a new transportation canal. It had been created to connect an older canal to the Spree River, as the map at the right shows. As noted, Kirchner's studies of the Elizabeth Canal all portray the pointed steeples of a neo-Gothic church, which had been constructed in 1906. In the other photograph at the top right, you can see that the bridges were built at the cross streets so that pedestrians could pass over the traffic in the water below. Kirchner features one of these bridges for pedestrians in both his oil painting and his woodcut of the Elizabeth Embankment. While the oil paintings from Kirchner's Berlin series use bright colors to gain expressive qualities, his woodcuts rely on disjunctive angles and tilted planes to create a sense of confusion, even anxiety, present in these works. Despite the different means of expression, both Kirchner's paintings and woodcuts interpret the human experience of a modern cityscape at this time. I'd now like to introduce Lindsay Keast, who is also a first-year graduate student, to turn to the prints in the exhibition by the members of the Blue Rider group in Munich.
Okay, my discussion will lead up to this print, and I'm going to tell you about everything that happened before that in Paul Klee's life, and also Kandinsky. Surprise! The German Expressionist group, the Blue Rider, finds its beginnings within the New Artists Association of Munich. This collection of artists joined together in January of 1909, the founding members including Alexei Jawlensky, Marianne Verefkin, Gabriele Munter, and Vasily Kandinsky, who was their chairman. In 1908, these members had spent 6 weeks in Murnau, a town in southern Germany, which would mark a highly influential period in the artists' lives. It was during this time in Murnau that Jawlensky refined his idea of synthesis, which he thought of as the combination of both the inner psyche and the natural world expressed in simplified forms, which would become the driving force for the association. Kandinsky created the membership card, a woodcut of 1909, originally entitled Cliffs. The design features knights on horseback, which mimic and blend into the forms of the landscape. The woodcut reveals Kandinsky's push towards abstraction, which can also be seen on the image on the right, titled Picture with Archer, of the same year. His theme of horse and rider is also apparent in the painting, along with the undulating forms of the landscape, which blend figure and ground, leaving it up to the viewer for interpretation. It was Kandinsky's push towards abstraction that began to cause tension in the group, as he moved away from the main emphasis on synthesis. A quote from Mark explains the differences in thought that caused a division between these artists. Quote, "A characteristic of the association was its heavy emphasis on the program. The members learned from each other's example, and there was a general competition to see who had the best grasp of the ideas. The word synthesis was heard rather too often. The young French and Russian guest exhibitors exercised a liberating influence. They gave one food for thought, and people began to understand that art is concerned with the most profound matters. The innovation is not a question of form, but of intellectual renewal. There was a reawakening of the mystical, of age-old elements which are vital to art." End quote. Kandinsky was at the forefront of these changes, responding to a world he saw as on the verge of destroying itself through enormous upheavals in civilization. He wanted to revitalize essential spiritual and artistic values. He strove for what he called the inner necessity, through the expressive capabilities of abstraction. Under the pressure of the group's conflicting ideas, Kandinsky resigned as chairman, but remained in the group. In 1911, when the jury met to determine the pieces for the next exhibition, they denied Kandinsky's composition number 5. In protest, Kandinsky, Mark, and Munter withdrew and formed the Blue Rider, displaying composition 5 in their first exhibition later that month. The new group was composed of artists such as Kandinsky, Mark, Munter, Paul Klee, and August Macke. The name Blue Rider was chosen by Kandinsky and Mark, referring to the common theme of the horse in the artwork of earlier years. The two began planning a publication called the Blue Rider Almanac, which would include theoretical essays outlining the new directions of modern art. The images on the right show Kandinsky's woodcut idea for the cover of the publication. Articles within the publication explored ideas revolving around form, color, and music of theater productions, and also new music from the Second Viennese School of Musical Composition. Arnold Schoenberg was a composer who broke the boundaries of traditional tonality and abandoned the use of key signature, resulting in contradictory ideas in his work, what he would call the emancipation of dissonance. Kandinsky was inspired by the expressive capabilities of Schoenberg, fostering a close friendship between the two. Another artist of the Blue Rider, Paul Klee, came from a different artistic background from the others in the group. Originally interested in caricature, Klee hoped to hold mankind up to ridicule. In 1906, a group of 17 etchings titled Inventions was considered his first artistic achievement. The prints exhibited the awkward ugliness of the human body, drawing from his interest in the grotesque and revealing the opposing ideas of the body as both beautiful and ugly. In these prints, Klee seems to be playing with imperfection and the inevitable failure of humanity in modern culture. He also employs symbolic, divine creatures such as the phoenix and responds to the human aspiration to fly, which he saw as a metaphor for creativity. Klee met the members of the New Artists Association through Macke and agreed with the overarching idea that art should primarily communicate through its expressive forms. In 1905, he discovered his enthusiasm for the simple lines and shapes of children's drawings. He was inspired by children's unadulterated perceptions of the world, causing him to uncover his own art from childhood to use as a reference for later pieces. Kandinsky and Munter were also to share an affinity for children's art. The formal interests, however, were much different than Kandinsky's, as Klee and Mark were both highly responsive to new developments in futurism and also analytical cubism, after viewing works displayed in Der Sturm and Blue Rider exhibitions. The dynamic force lines of futurism can be seen in Klee's Street Light in Town on the right, where the light of the street lamp penetrates the landscape, breaking the pictured objects into fragmented forms. He was interested in how the lines could express the energy of modern life by unifying the space, removing delineation between figure and ground. The Cubist influence can be seen in Klee's use of transparency, geometrical construction, and linear scaffolding, elements typical of the works of Braque and Picasso as seen on the left. The grid construction is clear in his 1913 painting, When God Considered the Creation of Plants. Klee had discovered how the grid, through an abstraction of form, could unify the composition. This idea can be seen in Little Cosmos of 1914, which is what we have on display in the exhibition. Cubism also introduced Klee to the formal qualities of African art and led him to a love of primitivism. Many of the simple geometric signs he incorporates reveal his admiration of folk, African, oceanic, and pre-Columbian art, which he was able to view in local museums. He also liberated the forms from gravitational confinement, dispersing the plants, humans, and symbols throughout the composition like heavens or a garden. This idea can be seen emerging in 1913 also with Passion Garden. And we're going to move on to Kate Beaver, who's also a first-year graduate student, who will continue Klee after 1914.
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay. All right. So we're going to briefly turn now to Vasily Kandinsky's Small Worlds 3, which is on view upstairs in the exhibition, which is the third lithograph from a portfolio of 12 published by Kandinsky in 1922, shortly after he began teaching at the Bauhaus in Weimar as master of form, responsible for the design and aesthetic aspects of the work. In 1911, Kandinsky had published his treatise on art theory concerning the spiritual in art, which presented his concern that art should contribute to a general spiritualization of culture and society. Kandinsky, and I'm quoting here, regarded the spiritual as something which is immaterial, not linked to the everyday world which we inhabit. It is something inner, something belonging to the soul, far removed from outer things and events. Simply put, art should contribute towards an encounter between the spiritual and the real through the employment of the evocative properties of color and abstract forms, point, line, and plane. By 1914, Kandinsky was painting almost entirely in an abstract manner, and by December 1914, he had returned to Moscow from Germany following the outbreak of the war. This portfolio, Kleine Welten, completed just 6 months after returning to Germany from Moscow, mixes elements from Kandinsky's period in Germany with new directions he had adopted following his return to Russia. While the floating forms and juxtaposed shapes in this series seem to belong within the realm of the spiritual developed from religious and fairy tale themes Kandinsky had frequently depicted in his work in Blue Rider, the question surfaces as to what extent can Kandinsky's explosions of form and color be viewed as an afterimage of urban evolution during World War I. The small circles, triangles, and rectangles relate to the more geometric forms Kandinsky had developed between 1915 and 1921 in response to suprematist and constructivist painting. As Kandinsky had progressed with abstraction, form and color had grown within his works to be seen as individual elements within the pictorial space, often leaving his works without a clearly discernible top or bottom. Small Worlds 3 is exemplary of what Rose Carol Washington Long has called the veiling of images, where the subject matter and form within Kandinsky's works, which appear initially to be ambiguous and abstract, over time develop to reveal gradually recognizable objects. Here, a maddening arrangement of color and abstract shapes first appear cataclysmic, and it is unclear where the eye is intended to begin reading the cyclical narrative. Thinking about this work within the context of post-war Europe and Kandinsky's contributions to post-Bolshevik cultural reform and the foundations of the Bauhaus, it is interesting to consider the relationship between Kandinsky's small worlds and the transformation of the urban landscape during these years. Art historian Karen Kohler has suggested that the small worlds compositions can in part be interpreted topographically, comparable to urban reformation of public transportation and axial planning in the Kremlin. In the spring of 1919, the Bauhaus opened in buildings that had formerly housed the Weimar Fine Arts Academy and the School of Arts and Crafts under the tutelage of architect Walter Gropius. Gropius's utopian vision of the Bauhaus resonated with Kandinsky, who in his essay, The Great Utopia, published in 1920, writes that art can break down the borders between countries and I'm quoting, "Art always goes in advance of all other realms of spiritual life. In the last few years, the frontiers between countries have not only disappeared, but have given a stoutness, strength, and impregnability scarcely approached since the Middle Ages. The impassable frontiers have, at the same time, constantly shifted as a result of the movements of armed forces against each other." Small Worlds should not be read purely as a formal narrative of post-war utopian concerns, for it also demonstrates an illusionistic treatment of space on an otherwise flat plane, and one has the impression of looking down upon an ever-extending and moving illustration of an urban or cosmological scene. This dualism between the physical and metaphysical is a convention that Kandinsky was particularly apt at cultivating, here extending the use of the picture design to mimic the intellectual mitigation of the meaning and significance of a post-war landscape. I'd like to transition now just to a brief introduction to Paul Klee's Lithograph, which was Calm from 1922, so the same year as Small Worlds, which is also on view upstairs, and a discussion of the comic grotesque. Klee, who, like Kandinsky, was also invited by Gropius to join the faculty of the Bauhaus post-war, and frequently employed fairy tale and fantastic creatures in his body of work. Almost half of Klay's 10,000 works, predominantly small-scale watercolors and drawings, were produced during the 10-year period where he instructed at the Bauhaus. Klay's pieces, though, are much more emblematic in their insinuation of dualism between the supernatural or metaphysical and the contemporary world, frequently culminating in grotesque or misshapen forms. Witch with the Comb is one of 30 commissioned lithographs completed by Klay between 1918 and 1922, the majority of which were completed from original drawings, and is a perfect example of Klay's satirical pluralism. A top-heavy figure stands centrally positioned. One sec, I'm just going to go back to the individual image first. A top-heavy figure stands centrally positioned in an open, invacuous space. The only suggestion of perspective or pictorial depth is offered by a softly shaded patch of ground beneath the character's feet, stretching back just a fraction of the composition. The witch is misshapen and does not immediately convey any obvious iconography that would suggest the figure would be supernatural, as the title of the lithograph insinuates. Okay. Her head is large and lopsided, with hair styled into a 1920s bob, the traditional bob clip oddly posed on top of her head like a crown. And with furrowed brows, she stares directly back at the observer, soberly daring you to laugh. A single dangling earring hangs from her left ear. Her mouth is covered by an opaque scarf, which is tied just over her right shoulder, and she seems to be wearing a stylized flapper dress. So far, despite the figure's strange form, everything seems normal. But, extending from her sleeves, one final detail that may nod to occult phenomena exists. In place of hands, this body has arrows pointing toward the ground, suggesting that this chic modern woman is not wholly human. These arrows are thus the key that unlocks the witch's narrative, permitting alternative interpretations to her otherwise profane, though bizarre, appearance. The arrow is a symbol frequently deployed by Klay to suggest movement of force. Generally speaking, in Klay's body of work, arrows that are aimed upward indicate rising forces that transcend the world, while those in downward fall tend to mean something catastrophic. Here, with two downward pointing arrows in place of hands, our modern witch seems condemned to catastrophe, perpetuated by her modern decadent tastes. The Witch with the Comb is just one example from Klay's body of work that is considered to be comic grotesque, a classification that attempts to define a type of aesthetic genre typical of an entire body of modern German artwork dating between 1870 and 1940, but rooted in literary and visual arts traditions dating to the discovery of classical mythological sculpture in Italy during the Renaissance, in which the phrase grotesco was first coined. The comic grotesque is a phrase with a complicated history that scholars have attempted to define in two ways. The first involves its etymological evolution from the Italian word grotesco, and the second involves stylistic origins rooted in literary and visual artistic traditions. Ultimately, 20th century grotesque can be defined as a fusion between Theodor Vischer's notion of the grotesque as a new form of the fantastic comic and Heinrich Schniegen's theory that the grotesque begins where impossibility commences. Thus, it transcends the representational or caricature. Klay's comic grotesque manifests in a conflation of stylistic choices portrayed here in Witch with the Comb, an evasion of formal concern with traditional notions of beauty, odd and contorted visual forms that are often an amalgamation of human and non-human parts, and pictorial space that is determined not by implementation of perspective, but through a fragmented reading of the compositional elements and symbols within the artwork that are used to convey movement and depth in tandem with a mediation between physical materiality and metaphysical spirituality. I'm now going to hand the mic over to Sarah Hwang, who's also a first-year master's student, so she can discuss the final works in the exhibition.
Franz Marc, born in 1880 and died in 1916, another member and co-founder of the Blue Writer Group, also represented the inner spirituality of art in his own works. Marc was born into a religious family in Munich in 1880 and grew up wanting to become a priest. After serving a year in the German military, he decided to pursue his interest in art and enrolled into the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. Here he trained in naturalism, but became very influenced by the French Impressionists, Post-Impressionists, and Art Nouveau after visiting Paris and Brittany in 1903 and 1907. In 1911, he joined the New Artists Association with his friends August Macke and Vasily Kandinsky. After about a year in the NAA, Mark and Kandinsky formed the Blue Rider Group, where they contributed and edited the famous Blue Rider Almanac. In this text, Mark wrote a seminal essay titled Spiritual Treasures, expressing lament about contemporary materialism and proposing a new art that coincided with the prevalent spiritual epic. Mark is probably most well known for his paintings of colorful animals. Here are two examples of his paintings from 1911 that present animal subjects, a year before the maturation of his animal paintings and the production of the Sleeping Shepherdess print that is displayed in the exhibition. One can begin to see the intermeshing of animals and environments by means of cubically chunky colored shapes in the painting of the large blue horses on the left. In Shepherds, both figure and animal experience the same blending of form and color seen in large blue horses, but the image then undergoes a sort of crystalline refraction that forms a new unity of figures with nature. In both Shepherds and our Sleeping Shepherdess print, the artist depicts his main foreground figures sleeping in the natural landscape. Even in large blue horses, the animals seem to be standing in a dreamlike, colorful landscape with their heads hanging low as if resting. Sleep is a common state in which Mark represents his figures and animals doing. Mark stated that in our sleep and dreams are where our quote-unquote true life and quote intimate reality of things end quote are captured. In other words, only in sleep can humanity leave the materialistic world and be united with nature. The medium of woodblock expressed the spirituality that Mark and the other Blue Rider members advocated in Sleeping Shepherdess. The woodblock itself is derived from nature, and the artist must laboriously carve his image into it before applying the ink. The technique itself already required the connectivity with nature that Mark and his colleagues revered so much. Mark's print was published twice in the famous German avant-garde periodical Der Sturm, or The Storm, once in 1913 and the second time in 1916. Der Sturm was founded in Berlin in 1910 by Herwarth Walden. It covered the whole gamut of the German Expressionism movement, featuring essays on theories of art, artist portfolios, and literary pieces from Expressionist dramas. Walden was advised on how to run his periodical by Karl Kraus, who was editor of a Viennese cultural journal, Die Fackel, or The Torch. As a byproduct of this partnership, Der Sturm was circulated in both Berlin and Vienna, featuring artists and architects from both cities. The photograph on the right shows Der Sturm founder Herwarth Walden and his partner Karl Kraus with a famous modernist architect and contributor to the periodical Adolf Loos. Other contributors and artists for the magazine included Peter Altenburg, Heinrich Mann, Vasily Kandinsky, August Macke, and an artist featured in the JSMA exhibition, Oskar Kokoschka. Kokoschka was a Viennese artist, writer, and playwright born to Czech and Austrian parents in 1886 and died in 1980. In 1907, he received a scholarship to attend the School of Applied Arts, where he became a member of the Wiener Werkstätte, or the Viennese workshops. His earlier works were very influenced by the famous Vienna secessionist Gustav Klimt, but after graduating in 1909, Kokoschka became influenced by Van Gogh. He began utilizing a more emotionally expressive style, especially in his portraits. He volunteered to serve in World War I and became seriously wounded in 1915. He was psychologically and physically affected by his war injuries and moved to Dresden in 1917, where he became professor at the Academy of Fine Arts 2 years later. By the time of his death in 1980, he produced 567 prints, including those he created for Der Sturm in 1910. Kokoschka was recruited by Karl Kraus to produce illustrations for Der Sturm. These illustrations included a series of portraits of the magazine's contributors, as seen in the following images on the screen. From left to right are print portraits of Herwarth Walden, Adolf Loos, and Karl Kraus from the Menschenkopf series, which roughly translates to heads of people or men. All of his print portraiture exhibits a wide range of restless lines and marks executed in brush, pen, and ink. The Kraus portrait in the exhibition shows the greatest amount of restlessness in the outline of the figure and in the folds and wrinkles of the subject's coat. The impatient nature of the lines is probably most noticeable in Krauss's hand, which appear in a strange pose exaggerated with elongated and bony fingers. This notion of anxiety can also be seen in Kokoschka's paintings of the same Der Sturm figures. The brushstrokes are quick and vary in shape and width, creating that same sense of unrest seen in the Der Sturm prints. The blending of forms and colors into the background and vice versa recall the paintings of the post-impressionists and even of the Italian futurists, creating a sense of movement. The figures themselves seem to be almost caricaturized, with exaggerated cheekbones, nose, and eyes, revealing the heavy intellectual minds of the subjects. The use of cool, dark colors also contribute to the anxiety and agitation of the portraits. The painting of Karl Kraus on the bottom right, from 1909, also shows him with long, bony fingers placed in front of him on his lap, much like Kraus's pose in the print version. Unfortunately, this portrait was destroyed in World War II, and only a black and white image of it exists today. So our final artist, Käthe Kollwitz, is the last artist from the exhibition who does not necessarily fall into the category of German Expressionism, but employs the medium of Expressionism, the woodcut print, in her works for social change. Born as Käthe Schmidt in Königsberg, Germany, Käthe grew up into a family who diligently advocated social principles and causes. Her father encouraged her to pursue art at the young age of 13. In 1885, she moved to Berlin to study with Karl Staffelbern, a Swedish portraitist. She then moved to Munich in 1888, where she attended the Women's Art School for 2 years. In 1891, Käthe married Dr. Karl Kollwitz, who was also very passionate about supporting humanitarian causes. Käthe Kollwitz was appointed director of the Berlin Academy of Art in 1919 and was the first woman to occupy this position. Due to the pressure from the National Socialist government, she was forced to resign and moved to escape the bombings in Berlin. In 1945, Kollwitz died in Moritzburg under the refuge of Prince Ernst Heinrich of Saxony. Kollwitz was always partial to depicting her surrounding environments from a humanitarian point of view. Her strong interest in supporting social causes drew her to printmaking, which allowed for her images to be distributed widely and numerously. One of her most well-known print series is The Weavers' Revolt of 1897. After viewing a performance of Gerhard Hauptmann's The Weavers, the artist was inspired to work on a series of etchings that were intended to illustrate a novel by Emile Zola. The play itself portrayed the oppression of the Silesian weavers in Poland and their failed revolt in 1842. Though Weaver's Revolt is not a literal illustration of the drama, the works provide a free and naturalistic expression of the workers' misery, hope, courage, and eventual doom. Another major cycle of works that Kollwitz created in lithography was the Peasant War of 1902. This series depicted the German Peasants War during the Reformation, when the peasants of South Germany decided to take arms against the church and the feudal lords for maltreatment and horrible work conditions. The scene of the outbreak, which is displayed here, which the museum also owns in its collection, shows the protagonist figure, Black Anna, leading an uprising of frustrated, overworked peasants. The V-shaped formation of the peasants and flurry of quick lines present a similar sense of unrest seen in Kokoschka's prints, as well as an overwhelming sense of movement as the peasants march through a hilly field with pitchforks and scythes. On January 15, 1919, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were arrested and assassinated by a right-wing military group. Liebknecht and Luxemburg were leaders of an extreme left-wing group called the Spartacus League during the German Revolution of 1918. The family of Karl Liebknecht asked Kollwitz to create a memorial portrait of the dead leader, to which Kollwitz agreed despite her differing political views. She discovered the medium of woodcut printing through the works of the expressionist Ernst Barlach and was inspired to create the memorial portrait using this expressive medium. The memorial sheet for Karl Liebknecht captures the mournful faces of the figures, paying their respect and expressing their deep sadness for the loss of the great leader. The saturation of the black ink filling in the mourning figures and the bold lines of the woodcut contribute to the heavy mood of the scene. The mother and baby also mourn for the loss of Liebknecht, yet simultaneously indicate the legacy that Liebknecht has left behind in this world, as Kollwitz used less ink to indicate a literal lightness to the figures. Liebknecht himself lies stiffly across the bottom of the image, recalling medieval tomb effigies. The caption, which roughly translates to "The Living to the Dead, Remembrance of January 15, 1919, refers to the title of a famous poem by Ferdinand Freiligarth called Die Toten an die Lebenden, which is "The Dead to the Living," inversing the title. The very composition and mood of the funeral for Liebknecht recalls the famous painting "The Death of Marat" by Jacques-Louis David, in which a revolutionary figure and journalist is shown murdered in his bathtub. And that's it. So we'll have the panel discussion now.
And we're going to take our seats up here, and be happy to entertain questions people may have, or considering observations. Oh, we need another chair. That's fine. That's fine. Good, thank you. I can't count. Yeah. Can you, I don't think I need this. I don't, and the records, you know, in the registrar's office don't really say much about that. My sense is that Pechstein had a dealer in New York City, and that something that dealers did during this time was to send exhibitions sort of around to university and perhaps also small city museums. Yeah, of their stock. And, you know, everything was available for purchase. And I'm not sure, but I would need to check, but the Le Corbusier painting that, you know, I forget where it is. I mean, it must be in the museum now. It used to hang in the art history office when I first came here. But my guess is that painting came out of a similar kind of exhibition. And so I think during the 1950s, there was this Widmer Art Fund, and you know, the faculty and the dean must have agreed on occasion to buy something that would hang on the wall of the dean's office or the library or whatever. The best thing, though, is that this Pechstein hung in the hallway of the Memorial Union, though. I mean, I just find that extraordinary. And live without any damage. John? Do you have a response?
I'm not sure about Mark so much.
Okay. I can respond, I think. One of the things that I think was apparent in I forget who quoted Mark from, you quoted Mark, right? Yeah. That Mark said that the the artists of the New Artists Association were following this kind of theoretical um, um, treatise or single line of approach of synthesis. And one of the things about the Blue Rider, in contrast to De Bruyne, is that all of the artists were completely different. Gabriele Munter, Kandinsky, Mark, Klee. They don't resemble each other formally at all, but they share a certain commitment to what they saw as inner sound, the communication that the fundamental importance of the work of art was to heighten spiritual awareness. Okay, and one of the things that the way Mark came to the group was that he saw this or he read this newspaper article that attacked one of the exhibitions of the New Artists Association, and he thought, this is nuts, this is great stuff. You know, I don't know these people, but I'm going to go find out who they are. And then they helped him publish a response in the newspaper to this, okay? You know, even when they got together, Kandinsky's work was totally different from Mark's. Although Mark, you know, in 1914 and during the months just before he went to battle and was killed in the First World War, he was turning to abstraction. So there is, with the exception of Munter, within the Blue Rider, a certain trend towards abstraction, even in Mark.
So, do you think that Mark was being influenced by Kandinsky, or he was evolving?
I think it's, I mean, there's, he may, I mean, the person that he was being influenced by, he was being influenced more by German Romantic traditions, and also by Robert and Sonia Delaunay and their kind of spirituality of color and so forth.
Impressed by the number of people from outside of pictorial art that participated in some of things. Like you got the writers of Holocaust
Yeah.
and Heinrich Mannevich at one
Yeah.
point. And then the architects, the Gropius, you have people in Petropolis, you know, people are interested in social movements.
Right.
Is there a sort of precedent for this anywhere else? I mean, these artists kind of, it seems like they're mostly historical work by themselves and rather artists or something like that. Is that this kind of integration? Do you think this is an exceptional time in art, or is it?
I think that because there were, this is a time when art is becoming commercialized. I mean, there is a lot of competition, there are different styles, everyone is vying, and they have to use modern means of communication, in a sense, to get out ahead of others. I mean, they have careers, right? And they're advancing their careers. And so, as a result, these cultural journals, like Der Sturm, become very important mouthpieces for ideas and images and so forth. And much more so than just an art magazine. So, you know, the Blue Rider Almanac, as you saw, had articles by artists, it had articles by musicians, it had sheet music by the Viennese School and so forth, and of course Der Sturm and Die Action and so forth. These were places where the arts came together. And of course there was at that time a kind of coming out of Jugendstil and Art Nouveau, a kind of interest in the integration of the arts. One of the things that I think is quite interesting is that it's not so much in Munich and not so much in Dresden, but it's rather in Berlin where art and literature really comes together. Yeah, and also in Vienna, of course. But in Germany, it's in Berlin where, the Neue Klub, which was a salon where the new poets recited their poetry and so forth. The artists began to go there and listen, and so Schmidt-Rottluff does this beautiful portrait of Elsa Lasker-Schuler. Yeah. Well, it's always said, and they said that the title came from a passage in Zarathustra by Nietzsche, in which he's talking about the need for a new type of person that is a bridge to the other shore. In other words, that he says, by going over, we go under. So, in other words, to get to something that is beyond, let's say, the staidness and the absolute rationality of bourgeois humanity, that one has to descend in a Freudian sense, I think, and by that one incorporates into one brings together the Dionysian and the Apollonian into some sort of Superman, as he called it, Ubermensch. I mean, there are problems. Yeah, but it could go wrong. Rachel? Do you have something to say just from the class about Munter or anything? I mean, we haven't really talked about Hebrika yet.
I think this is really uncomfortable for me. Sorry. And I was actually, so I thought about Munter and then Klee, which are both, writers. So for Klee, I think that it was definitely, his treatment of the object was something more related to materiality and sort of his concern with modernity in general. And it was much more sort of a global concern, whereas with other artists it's more representational. but I don't know what you would say about Tipuca, the difference specifically between the two groups. Because even within the rhetoric, there's very basic interpretation of the objects. And it's not like in surrealism where you have to like two specific object theories. I would be interested actually to hear what you think about Tipuca.
Yeah, I think that one of the things, it's actually something that I've just written and sent off to a magazine about expressionist still lifes. I think there is an unusual character of the best expressionist still lifes, in my opinion. And that is that the objects in the still life are not dead life. Okay? They are animated in some way. They become actors in literally a drama. That is obviously an illusion, but I think in that painting by Pechstein, that pipe head has it's not just a pipe head. It has a life. It has the flowers bring it alive, in a sense. This was something that Gauguin did with some of his ceramics too. He brought them alive, and I think it's a way of for Kirchner in particular. One of the things that one finds in his work is that he treats the table not only as a place in which sculptures begin to interact with each other, but also he makes it a space that is an intimate space, that is a lived space. In other words, it's not like Cézanne where you're looking at something that is formally arranged. It's something where that cup is tea that you drink. I'm not putting it well, but I guess the issue is that and for instance in Nolde's work, okay, he goes to the ethnographic museum and he selects objects from different world cultures, and then he makes them interact with each other in a little theater that's a table. He takes a lion, a carving of a lion from Africa, and you have the drawing as it exists in the Berlin Ethnographic Museum. But then as he paints it, he has, the lion is standing there on a base on 4 legs, but in the painting it is broken away from the base and is rearing up and is going to devour a figure standing in front of it. I mean, he just, creates a new world. So that's very different from Monet.
So there seems to be sort of, in what you're saying, a dual function,
Yeah.
right? So there's a sort of mediate, and I think this exists in both groups, there's like a mediation between the symbolism of the object and then its cinematic performance within the work itself, that I think might be actually consistent in some ways.
And I think also just it's like we all have our objects, right? We all have our rocks. We all have our pieces of driftwood, right? That is nothing to someone else, possibly, but everything to us. Because we remember why we chose it. We remember why we live with it, why we maintain it. And it's invested with a kind of ritual meaning for us. And I think that is part of why these ritual objects had so much importance for them, in a way. They are invested, there is human intention but also human emotion lodged in it. And you bring that alive instead of. It's not dead. You bring it alive. But you know, one of the interesting things is that there's one of the members of the Blue Rider and also another group called the Rhineland Expressionists is this artist August Macke. And Macke is the poet of the modern world in a way. I mean, he is fascinated by Persian miniatures, by all sorts of, you know, mainly Middle Eastern art. But one of the interesting things is that he's also really interested in the way that modern advertising techniques lend aura to commodities. In other words, he makes them intensely beautiful in the same way that a shop dresser makes them intensely beautiful by a spotlight with a colored gel on it, you know? And so he understood that there was a kind of, that you could invest the, you know, the cheapest thing from a department store with a kind of beauty. And this literally is the period, you know, of the aestheticization of selling. So it's kind of all folded together in a way.
Does that lend itself later to when Minter is still acquiring kind of commodified objects from these, like from Murnau and these cheaper things? They're more mass-produced, but she still feels that they're imbued with a sense of spirituality.
Yeah, except that I think that, you know, that's growing out of something that, it's growing out of a nostalgia, I think, that everyone feels for that good old world that you came to the city from, right? That Gemeinschaft rather than Gesellschaft, that community rather than society, right? Whereas I think the unusual thing about Macke is that he's finding a kind of spirituality in a hat, a mass-produced hat. Yeah. 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 I kind of think I need to answer that one too, maybe. One of the, I heard an interesting, well, there's an interesting paper that recently appeared in an anthology about Die Brücke, and one of the things that they point out is that Pechstein is very different from the other members of Die Brücke in that he was a trained painter. The others were self-taught, you know, and they actually, you know, the early things, they aren't great paintings. I mean, they're innovative, they're adventuresome and so forth, but they don't necessarily totally work as paintings. They had to learn to do that. And so Pechstein sort of, from the beginning, was seen as the leading painter of the group. It made the others a little bit, you know, dead. You know. But they had formed as a group because they had come to understand that there was, I mean, it was a career strategy. You could get farther as a group than you could get as an individual first, okay? When they became famous as a group, then they split and they went their own ways. So that one of the things that happened was that they came to Berlin, they were going to continue to advance their cause as a group, and then the Berlin secession is up a notch in the artistic hierarchy, and they ask Pechstein to show. And so he breaks, he shows. And he thinks, oh, I'm just going to come back. I'm going to do both. And they say, no, you aren't. So you're out. You're out of the band. You know, we're going to get a new drummer. But he did quite well, thank you. Okay. Okay. And you know, if you have the interest and free time on Saturday, I think you might come. You know, invite you certainly to come to the conference. We have 4 speakers from outside. Actually, we just have 3 now, because someone just wrote me and he's hurt his knee and he can't travel. But we have his paper and we have his PowerPoint, and Joyce Chang was his student, and she's going to read it, which is nice. We have someone from German Expressionist who will be talking about Karl Kraus and Oskar Kokoschka. And then we have Mark Haxthausen from Williams College, who I consider the best scholar of 20th century German art. And he's going to be speaking about Expressionism, where did that word come from, what does it mean, and so forth. And then there's a professor from Southwest College, our university in just north of Austin. Is that a college, a university? I know. But she wrote a great book on the trees, the tree paintings of Egon Schiele, and she's going to be speaking about Franz Marc and issues of physiology and perception. And then someone else from Seattle University is going to be talking about the enthusiasm of these artists for El Greco, who's seen as an expressionist, you know, before the existence of Expressionism. I'm going to talk about relationships between Die Brücke and Cubism. And then Ken Calhoun from Komplet in German is going to be talking about relationships between Expressionist cinema and German Romanticism. So it should be a nice day. In Gerlinger Lounge, so the second floor of the east end of Gerlinger. So thank you for coming tonight. Really appreciate it.